The winter of 1609 to 1610 is referred to as the starving time in Jamestown, Virginia, England's first permanent settlement in the Americas. A perfect storm of events, poor harvest, disease, violent relations with indigenous neighbors, an influx of new settlers without any new provisions, and an actual hurricane led to the starvation and death of around 80% of Jamestown settlers that winter. Survivors resorted to eating unconventional meals in order to survive. Horses, dogs, cats, rats, and even the bodies of the dead. Various first-hand accounts written by settlers reported survival cannibalism during the starving time, with no evidence to actually back it up. But did you know, in 2012, archaeologists working at Jamestown finally uncovered solid forensic evidence to confirm those claims? Let's fix that. Hello, I'm Shayla Fontaine, and you're listening to History Fix, where I discuss lesser-known true stories from history you won't be able to stop thinking about. Y'all, I am all messed up. I am so messed up after this week's episode about Pocahontas. I listened to it right after I finished recording just to make sure there weren't any major editing issues or anything. So I finished recording and then immediately listened to it and got like 2 minutes into the episode and I was like, what? Why did I say Pocahontas was in my top 5 favorite Disney movies? I hate that movie now. I hate Disney now. It's all so messed up. And then that night I went to a concert. It was like a Grateful Dead cover band. And I was looking around at this concert and it's just a bunch of white people. It's just all white people. Not a single indigenous person that I can see. And for some context, the concert took place on Roanoke Island, which is the site of the failed 1587 Roanoke colony, aka Lost Colony, that preceded Jamestown. So it's just a bunch of white people. And we're all so happy and dancing around in tie-dye t-shirts on the ancestral lands of the people who were already there when our ancestors arrived. And I'm having an existential crisis. I'm not on drugs. I didn't do any drugs. I had one beer. I'm having an existential crisis because I do not know how I'm supposed to feel. I don't know how to reconcile this. What do I do? I feel so guilty, but what can I do? All I can do is try to be a better person, be aware, raise my boys to be better people. That's all I can do. Anyway, let's talk about the starving time. By the way, if you missed the Pocahontas episode, you should definitely go back and listen. I'm literally a changed person after that one. I straight up changed from the beginning of that episode to the end. In the episode, I talk about the Jamestown colony, which was an English colony established in 1607 in modern-day Virginia in the United States. They just plopped it down in the middle of land already occupied by the Powhatan, an indigenous group, an empire really, that had lived there for thousands of years. And ultimately, Jamestown led to the destruction of that entire civilization within 2 generations. But before that, Jamestown itself almost didn't make it. Jamestown was not England's first attempt to colonize North America. That attempt by Sir Walter Raleigh during the reign of Elizabeth I was a complete failure. Her successor, King James I, wanted to try again. So in 1607, he sent 100 men over to erect a fort and establish a settlement, Jamestown, on the east coast of what is now the state of Virginia. Jamestown struggled immensely. If you listen to this week's episode about Pocahontas, you know the men were basically trapped inside their fort, unable to leave to hunt or barter for food without being killed by the neighboring Powhatan tribe. They were not self-sufficient at all. They relied on supply ships from England to bring provisions. And I'm sure they wanted nothing more than to hop on these ships themselves and return to England. But King James was determined that this colony should succeed, and he refused to listen to anything but positive news about the state of Jamestown. They basically had to pretend that everything was fine when it wasn't. So, that state of denial meant that more and more colonists were sent over to Jamestown, including women and children. There's nothing permanent about a colony full of men. Men cannot reproduce. Women are necessary if a colony is to continue past one generation. The first 2 women arrived in Jamestown on a supply ship in October of 1608. In August of 1609, the largest supply fleet yet was sent. It included 7 ships and 2 smaller vessels called pinnaces with food and other provisions, plus hundreds of new colonists willing to give it a go in Jamestown. Willing, of course, because they had been told it was just dandy over there. They had no idea how horrific life really was at Jamestown. But it was an ill-fated voyage. A hurricane all but destroyed the fleet shortly before it reached Virginia, sinking the supply ships and wrecking its flagship Sea Venture upon the reefs of Bermuda. Some of the ships survived the storm and made it to Virginia. So basically what happened is the supply ships sank, but many of the colonists survived. So hundreds of new mouths to feed are flooding into Jamestown with none of the provisions they had brought with them from England. They ate through the settlement's 7 acres of planted corn in 3 days. That winter, hundreds died of starvation, trapped within the high palisade walls of the fort, surrounded by hostile natives. Natives that, by the way, were hostile for good reason. Before this, the settlers' strategy was to raid indigenous villages to steal their food. So at this point, Chief Powhatan had ordered that any white men be killed on sight, effectively trapping them inside their fort. So they're starving. Written accounts of that time, that winter of 1609 leading into 1610, report settlers digging up dead bodies out of graves and eating them. According to acting Governor George Percy, others, quote, licked up the blood which had fallen from their weak fellows. Percy also reports one settler allegedly murdering his pregnant wife. Sorry, this is rough. Skip ahead 15 seconds if this is going to mess you up. Percy says the man murdered her, quote, as she slept in his bosom, ripped the child out of her womb and threw it into the river, and after chopped the mother in pieces and salted her for his food. So this is beyond desperation. But these are all just witness accounts. There was no solid evidence besides what the settlers said happened in their journals and letters and wherever they were writing this stuff down until 2012. In 2012, archaeologists working for the Jamestown Rediscovery Project discovered an L-shaped cellar that appeared to have once been used as a kitchen. It was dated back to 1608, so very early in the life of the colony, and had actually been filled in at some point, likely in 1610, just after the starving time as part of a cleanup, a reset, basically, ordered by the colony's new governor. It appeared to have been used as a trash pit at some point, or at least the contents of a trash pit had been dumped into it when it was filled in with dirt. They found indigenous pottery that was used by the colonists, glass trade beads, butchered animal bones, and most interesting of all, a partial human skull that appeared to have been intentionally chopped in half. Skull pieces, a jawbone complete with teeth, and some leg bones were collected from the cellar and sent to a lab for analysis. They were able to determine that the bones belonged to a European female who was around 14 years old when she died. So that seems mega specific from just a few old scraps. The Jamestown Rediscovery website, which I linked in the description, does a really good job of explaining the science behind these conclusions, but I'll sum it up for you. First of all, they could tell she was a female based on the size and shape of her skull. Female skulls are distinctly different from male skulls. Her teeth told them a lot about her age. At around age 15, wisdom teeth start to erupt from the jaw. Hers had not yet. They also had a piece of her tibia, a leg bone, with a growth plate at the knee that was just starting to fuse together. So between the unerupted wisdom teeth and the not quite fused yet growth plate, they determined she was likely around 14 years old. Now, how did they know she was a settler and not an indigenous girl? This is actually super interesting. First of all, there are some visible cranial differences between Europeans and indigenous Americans, but they did some even cooler testing to confirm. They basically test oxygen, carbon, and nitrogen isotopes stored in bone. These indicate what sort of diet someone had eaten throughout their life. The isotopes in this girl's bones reflected a European wheat-based diet, not an American corn-based diet. She had likely recently immigrated to Jamestown from the southern coast of England based on her diet, probably in that August of 1609, the fleet that barely made it through the hurricane. She probably died of natural causes, most likely starvation. That's pretty much all we know about Jane when she was alive. And FYI, her name probably wasn't Jane, although it could have been. That was a common name at the time. Jane is just a name given to unidentified female remains. John Doe for males, Jane Doe for females. According to the Jamestown Rediscovery website, quote, "We know so little about Jane because, like most women and children of the time, she was not recorded in historical documents," end quote. So we're left now with just bones, not even a name. However, Jane's bones had a whole nother very gruesome story to tell. Forensic analysis of the bones showed that her body had been intentionally mutilated after death using at least 3 different sharp instruments. There are 4 shallow chop marks in her forehead that suggest a failed first attempt to open up her skull. There are more marks on the back of the head, likely created by forceful blows from a hatchet that eventually split the skull in 2. There are also small knife cuts in the bone beneath the right eye socket, where the cheek muscle was likely removed. There are more knife cuts on the lower jaw, and the left temporal bone was punctured by a small rectangular tool, prying the bone from the side of the head to get to the brain. The right tibia bone, the leg bone, has a chop mark in it below the knee that broke the bone open, exposing the marrow, and fine cuts suggest a knife was used to remove the leg from the body. So this is a lot of work, and these people didn't have any energy to spare. The only reason for this, the only reason to do this to a dead body is to eat it, to save yourself from starvation. But my God, can you imagine? Can you imagine having to resort to this? Whoever did this, they likely knew this girl. They saw her get off the ship. They lived with her inside the fort until her untimely death. The hatchet marks in the middle of the forehead really get me. I mean, I know she was already dead, but it's just so barbaric. The desperation, the frantic desperation to survive is just written all over those bones. Although they only found part of Jane's skull, they were able to create a complete model using mirror imaging and computers to fill in the gaps. A resin cast of the complete skull was made, and a forensic sculptor used modeling clay to create a lifelike recreation of Jane's likeness. It is striking. It is wild to see her come to life like that after 400 years in a trash pit. I'm haunted by this image of Jane. I have a photo, of course, of her facial reconstruction on my Instagram at HistoryFixPodcast, and you can see some images of her bones with cut marks in them too. But also, please check out the Jamestown Rediscovery website I have linked in the description. There are amazing videos and images, and they've just done a really good job putting all the information together. I got so sucked in to this website. So what are we left with here? Just some pieces of old bone in a trash pit. A girl, 14 years old, whose identity has been lost to the ages. But this find is significant because for the first time, it confirms reports of cannibalism at Jamestown. It's the only piece of physical evidence, forensic evidence, that we have. If there's anything the Pocahontas episode taught me, it's that you can't believe everything you read. These historical accounts, these witness accounts, are not always reliable. They could have written down whatever they wanted, and we'd automatically think it was true just because they were there and we weren't. John Smith sure stretched the truth in his accounts of his experience at Jamestown. I wouldn't put it past Governor Percy or any of the rest of them either. But Jane's bones are another type of evidence entirely. These bones, picked and scraped and cut and hacked apart by once civilized people, are the only credible evidence we have to suggest that, yes, the situation did become so dire at Jamestown that people were literally hacking dead bodies into bits and eating their brains. Thank you all so much for listening to this mini fix. I hope you found this story as interesting as I did. Also, sorry the first 3 mini fixes have all been about dead bodies. That was not intentional. Don't forget to head over to my Instagram at HistoryFixPodcast to see that image of Jane's facial reconstruction. And if you're as sucked into this story as I am, tap the link in the description to check out the Jamestown Rediscovery website with videos, images, and all kinds of info about this incredible find. Thank you so much for listening to History Fix. Check back in on Sunday for your regularly scheduled full-length episode.